So today we're going to dive into a critical topic for Phoenix, especially given that it's one of the hottest cities in the country, if not on the planet, and how the increased heat that we're experiencing is impacting communities and especially individuals. And to do that, I've got two good colleagues with me, Jenny and Konrad. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Duke. Happy to be here.
So why don't we just do a little bit of additional information on your backgrounds, and Jenny, we'll start with you, how you got into this work with regard to extreme heat and its effect on individuals.
Yeah, so I come at this from the atmospheric science and environmental science world, from my PhD, and started to apply what we know about urban microclimates to how humans experience those microclimates, especially when it comes to extreme heat and how that affects the human body from thermal comfort all the way up to heat strain. And so since then, been trying to collaborate with engineers and thermophysiologists to really answer some of these bigger questions.
And Konrad, a bit about your background. And I know your parents had some interesting backgrounds as well, which maybe led you into some of this work.
Okay, so my background's in mechanical engineering and in thermal sciences specifically. I come from a very scientist-oriented family. My dad's a nuclear physicist and has contributed to 3 elements that are now on the periodic chart. So I ended up moving around my entire life until high school to different nuclear labs throughout Europe and the United States. I've actually started off working in Oak Ridge National Lab in high school doing nuclear physics, but then I decided to switch to something more concrete and did mechanical engineering. And then I've done a number of different projects related to more of power plant cooling or microelectronics efficiency and so on. And about 5 years ago, for a number of reasons, the most obvious one, living in Phoenix, I switched from cooling electronics to trying to cool people better. And we do that all the way from a sweat gland to whole body level with the work we're doing with Jenny.
And I think we're going to be joined by one of your colleagues, Andy, who is particularly expert in this field. Andy, if you could introduce yourself. So I'm not hearing Andy. Jennifer, maybe you can help me out. Is Andy there with you?
So Andy's here, but Andy doesn't speak.
Okay. Well, maybe you can speak for him and tell us a little bit about Andy.
Yeah, Andy is a thermal mannequin. Andy stands for Advanced Newton Dynamic Instrument, and we bought Andy a couple of years ago, and he's a very expensive instrument that helps us understand how the body responds to extreme heat in different spaces, and we can also use Andy to help measure heat when it comes to looking at the sun's impact on the body or just that overall high air temperature impact on the body or evaporative heat loss from the body. Andy has a lot of sweat glands, but not near as much as the human body. And we can bring Andy outside. So he's actually the only walking, breathing, sweating thermal mannequin in the world that can go outside.
So I assume Andy's comfortable with you calling him an expensive instrument.
Yes.
How expensive is Andy?
More than your house.
Yeah, we like to say more than your house. Konrad can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think around $500,000 plus.
It was
with all the bells and whistles.
That's the baseline would be around there, but ours was custom, and you can. It's a public information. You can see it in the grant from NSF. It's about 650. So what makes Andy unique, and the general line of Andys, is that as opposed to other thermal mannequins that are used mostly to design performance and safety apparel. So, you know, your ski jacket might be designed optimized using a thermal mannequin, or your warfighter gear is firefighter gear. They're used in general in that sense for clothing. What makes Andy special is he has, besides having heaters, so he could generate heat like you shiver when you're cold, he also has internal cooling. So he can also pull heat from the environment And that is something critical to go study heat in the outside. So when you look at him, you see kind of shell. He has 35 different zones, and each zone is controlled independently. So when we pop him open, you see a whole zoo of wires, microcontrollers, tubing. There's tubing for the sweat. There's tubing for the cooling channels, and it's 35 independently controlled little devices that, let's say, corresponds to his face and so on.
And the reason this is so important, and we're getting right to it, in the summer here in Phoenix, temperatures getting close to 120 degrees are not rare. It happens. And we've had an increasing number of deaths in the city of Phoenix or the metro area because of heat. People out there working in this heat, doing difficult jobs, or a variety of other things that might put them in difficult positions with regard to heat. So understanding how the body responds to heat is at the core of what I think you both are doing. Jennifer, maybe could you connect this to what Phoenix is trying to do to respond to what we know is the difficult condition?
Yeah. I think a good way to think about our reasons for, one of our main reasons for needing something like Andy is that any research that's been done on people, especially in a controlled thermal chamber, can only go so far in terms of rising the core body temperature to a level that is safe, but tells us a little bit about the strain that a human is experiencing. Beyond levels of about 39.5, 40 degrees Celsius, you won't get research ethics approval to do that work because it's very dangerous, especially for vulnerable populations. With Andy, we can try and test these different unique situations that we know people are dying in or really struggling in the city, and allow them to reach a critical thermal maximum in the body, such as 43 degrees Celsius core temperature, which a lot of people would die before they got to that level anyways, but it allows us to do unethical research with an instrument that we could never do in the real world. And because we can take Andy to outdoor spaces, then we can start to look at what are the contributing factors in those spaces that are affecting him, or we can take Andy to an indoor space like an overheated mobile home, for example. And we haven't done that yet, but that's part of the plans as he goes on these field trips in the summer soon, or what we're calling riskscapes in the larger heatscape of the city.
Mm-hmm. And so Andy can obviously move around. I've seen him in various places. Mm-hmm. I think he's accompanied by Marty. And Konrad, maybe you want to explain who Marty is, Andy's sidekick?
Sure. So Marty is a advanced biometeorological card, it's a mouthful, developed by Professor Ariane Middle here at ASU. And it's essentially measuring all the parameters of the hot environment that can impact the human body. So it's not only, let's say, airflow, but it's also the radiation that involves the sun that's coming at us or being reflected, as well as infrared radiation that's being emitted by the environment. And the idea is with Marty, we can measure these environmental parameters. With Andy, we measure the response to them. And then virtually, Andy has a twin and a very large computational family. And we're feeding the data from Marty to simulate how different people would respond to the same environment.
Mm-hmm. And so when you're moving Andy and Marty around into places Phoenix specific, first to take in the heat that's available there, probably much of it radiating off of surfaces, some of it directly from the sun, whatever it might be. The ways to accommodate those conditions and or reduce the stress on a human body would be what, Jennifer? And what is Phoenix trying to do to manage that?
Yeah, there's a lot of ways we can think about this. In a place like Phoenix, one of the number one ways we can improve people's thermal experiences in the summer is by shading them.
Mhm.
by decreasing their overall heat burden, because that sunlight is so intense and we have such clear skies here in our dry climate. And so part of the city's portfolio is to add shade in, not just tree shade using desert adaptive shade species, but built shade. So hundreds of new built structures across the city, in playgrounds and schoolyards, to put shade where people spend time, bus stops, the walking routes they're taking. So that's a big part of it. And we've done some testing with Andy in sun and shade and partial shade to kind of look at the differences in the experience, but also be able to develop new ways to measure the radiative heat loads on the human body that do not cost the cost of Andy or Marty, but even smaller and much more low cost, that Konrad has been working on as part of this project. So we can help, say, the city of Phoenix do measurements in smaller spaces that doesn't cost $650,000 to do, because Andy can't go everywhere. But
Right.
yeah.
You want to add to that, Konrad?
Yeah, so absolutely. So Andy and Marty are going to be joined by, I can say, younger sister Carla soon. We have an acronym for that. It's a cylindrical anemometer radiometer. And, with the theme of comparing costs, right? Andy is roughly costs like a house. Marty probably will, it's somewhere around the cost of a used car. And Carla is going to be cheaper than a cell phone. But they all agree, obviously, the cheaper you go, the less spatial information you get. But on a whole body basis, they agree is the idea.
So when you're traveling around Phoenix, and I think equity is a big part of your mission. I think we can look at maps of the core of Phoenix, and we can see that incomes to some degree correspond with the temperatures in certain neighborhoods, why they're higher in those places, and a variety of other things. Uh, Trees and shade, as you just mentioned, Jennifer, are often mentioned. They come with issues of maintenance and water. So I'm glad to hear you mentioning built structures. And you also mentioned specifically bus stops. When we look at things like bus stops in the city, often you'll see a response from designers. I hate to say this, being an architect myself, they're almost treating shade as if it was like rain, that somehow there's a place over the bus stop directly above where someone might stand, but the sun is coming at angles and other situations. Are designers responding to the information that you're generating and saying, if we're going to be super effective at generating shade, things have to look different than they currently do? They really need to perform at a higher level. Are you getting a response in that regard?
The designers we have worked with have been more with the cities. So we've done some work with the city of Tempe to do some shade mapping over bus stops. And when I say we, it's mostly Dr. Ariana Medel, who's part of our larger team. And she has this great shade tracking tool that essentially maps that sun over the sky throughout the day on whatever day and time you want. And you can kind of put a shade structure in, and then you can say, if you move it this way or that way, or make it bigger or smaller, or add in vertical shade to get those lower sun angles, how does that improve the overall mean radiant load on a person? So decrease their sun exposure. And so she's leading the way on that kind of work with things like bus stops, or even we could do the same thing with trees along a sidewalk or shade sails in a playground, and then has kind of partners throughout the cities, not with private landscape or not with private firms that do design, but more so with the cities, because the cities are the ones installing those and making kind of the decisions, and they're very expensive too.
Right. They are, surprisingly so. But and yes, when I was thinking of designers or people implementing this, I am thinking of cities and those charged with doing this. But as I even heard the president of the university say not too long ago, if you look out the window, our buildings and the built environment here doesn't reflect enough of the fact that we know we're in the climate we are, with the sun as bright and hot and as powerful as it is here. Our structures should be more tailored to the way that we really are here. And you've got this data coming from Andy and Ariane's work as well. Konrad, anything you want to add to what you think we need to be doing to demonstrate we fully are embracing the situation that we're in here? And one that I'm unfortunately going to report, it's not news, it's never going to get cooler here. It's only going to get warmer. And therefore, we have to get smarter about the built environment.
So I think you brought up a couple of interesting points that bring up the issue that it's honestly much easier to change what you're wearing rather than to change your built environment. And that's another aspect that we're finally moving into testing with Andy, and we have some preliminary efforts with that. The question is, right, so comparing color of my shirt and color of Jenny's shirt, what is better to wear in the summer? It's rather obvious that the white one is good, but then the question become, there's a lot of different whites out there. Actually, when you look at the textiles that are being sold, there's a lot of white could mean it reflects solar, but there's also the infrared part of the solar spectrum that we don't see, and different shirts don't do that. There's things like cool black, actually, that have different pigments in them. And there's a lot of, effort out there from the textile side and selling sun shirts and things like that. And the question is, how well do they work? So we've done some tests with Andy, and we were developing a way to very quickly change them into different shirts out in the sun. And it's an interesting problem. And like, how do you make a protocol to do it reliable in conditions that are changing? But yeah, white shirt is definitely better than a black shirt. Interestingly, it's always, any shirt is better than no shirt at all.
So you're particularly interested in sweat, evaporation, how the body technically works, which obviously relates to the clothing that you're wearing, and to maximize the positive impact of what something that you would put on could do for you in heat. Is that right? Is that part of your research?
Absolutely, yeah. So we look at sweating from real people, on kind of the single sweat gland level, because it turned out that's not very well understood. And the whole point of sweating is that the sweat evaporates. If your sweat drips from you, it's wasted, right? The cooling power comes, especially, in Phoenix, from the evaporation.
So there's a lot of data and learning coming from Andy, and we're talking about Phoenix, which is a hot, dry climate. So if I'm going to export what you have understood to, let's say, Houston or New Orleans, other 10 across cities where the humidity is a major factor and equally deadly in the wrong circumstances, how can you translate what you're learning to different places and even to different situations?
Well, I'll start with, because we can't increase the humidity outside. We have to work with what we have here. So because we have a thermal chamber at ASU right beside where I'm standing, that Andy generally spends most of his days and nights in, we can simulate these more hot, humid environments. And in those environments that have higher humidity, still high temperatures, lower sunlight in general, you're really going to need to figure out how to get wind flow in there. And everybody knows that when the air is stagnant and it's really humid, you get a lot of that ineffective sweating that Konrad mentioned. That's just dripping off the skin. It's not evaporating. So by adding airflow in, that really supports evaporation of sweat off the skin, which supports cooling. And so that's why you hear more recommendations to use fans in hot, humid places. And then you're not going to worry about the sunlight quite as much. But a lot of our work too, part of this project and other research going on at ASU, is really interested in differentiating what the dry heat does to a human body than what the humid heat does to the human body, and what are the pathways to experiencing really high core temperatures look like.
We found that discussions with other cities in the 10 across geography around things like water, even though we live in a very dry, arid climate here, and in the Gulf region, it's quite different, as you know, much more humid and wet generally. But when we have discussions between parties coming from different parts of the country, they discover how much they have in common, not so much in the landscape, but in the process by which they're trying to understand what's happening there. So are you in dialogue with people in other cities, other universities, other institutes, and how they're going about their work that might be parallel to yours, even though the environment's different? And Konrad or Jennifer, either one of you could answer. Maybe Konrad, you could start with that.
Sure. So I've lived in Georgia, Tennessee, and DC for about a total of 20 years. So I am keenly aware of what we're discussing across, the other part of the Sun Belt. And I think yes, we have discussions, and it's a very different experience in terms of it. And I think the solution, for example, clothing, right? There's a different. You want to wear a different type of textile when you're in Phoenix versus when you're in climates like Georgia. So I think getting that information quantified and having recommendations on that is really important. And I'm sure Jenny has a number of collaborations, right, with looking more at the climatic aspects.
Yeah, actually, we have a project also funded by the National Science Foundation on the development of a global center on heat adaptation, where we're working with people from Singapore, which is very hot and humid, Sydney, Australia, up in Canada, in Montreal, which is more of a humid summertime climate, and then, of course, here in Phoenix. And then we're expanding that network and doing some research, actually, data collection down in Colombia, South America, this month. So there's a lot to be learned around not just we understand what the general climates are in these places, but what's interesting too is how people behave in those climates and why. And so something like humidity can really affect your thermal comfort pretty quickly, and that drives behavior change. And it's interesting to talk to colleagues across these spaces in understanding how people behave and what people do about the heat, and also like how researchers are understanding that versus the general population, and talking to people, because everybody has experienced heat and everybody has their own coping behaviors and strategies to deal with it. Those look very different across the population because of access to resources, access to money, essentially. And then of course, in the South, we just have more access to things like air conditioning versus in the North when a heat wave comes in. So it's that kind of thinking, but then it merges quite a bit with this project with Andy when we start to try and understand how people are impacted in these different types of climates when they also have comorbidities or different body sizes or are wearing different clothing. And so there's all these synergies across these spaces when we're trying to understand an individual person versus a population versus then what the city is doing to design around heat, which, to kind of get back to your original question, that doesn't seem to differ that much, which is interesting, right?
But you can calibrate, as I understand it, Andy, and or manage the data to not only respond to the environment, but to different body types. And we talked about comorbidities, and obviously in this country, we have some challenges in that regard with regard to our diets and a variety of other things. And many of those troubling circumstances are in our geography. We can see diabetes in the Deep South and other places like that. So you take those things into account by suggesting how one might accommodate those issues given who you are and your situation and particular bodies.
That's the goal. So the way this works, right? As I mentioned, Andy doesn't have a heart, he doesn't have a liver, he doesn't have a kidney that's going to fail. He has a bunch of tubing. The way we account for that, he is controlled by a program that responds like a human person would. So it tells him, hey, you're hot, sweat more, you're cold, start shivering, which just means generate heat, which is what your muscles do. Now we have the ability there to go and tune that model to represent different people. In the long term, we would like to add different medical conditions or physiological conditions you may have to account for that. And then Andy is basically a instrument that feeds, how much heat goes in and out of the body based on what the program will tell it. And then the program kind of redistributes it to say, oh, the heat went more into the core and around it, right? So this is where we have that ability to represent different people right now. And then the idea is to go and represent different medical issues that can be contributing to heat illness.
And Jenny, if I understand this correctly, you're interested in what might be called instruments, high performance athletes, right? Who are really measuring what they're doing, what their intake is, and how their performance is impacted by heat. Is that right?
Yeah, we do a little bit of work on that. We consider athletes pretty vulnerable populations, largely due to their overmotivation. They're going to push as hard as they can in the heat, and that can result in them pushing too far to really dangerous situations. So there's that part of it, but then also the performance aspect. And there's a lot of researchers at ASU also interested in heat performance in the heat as temperatures are rising, and not just performance for athletes, but performance for outdoor workers to keep productivity up and keep them safe. I do a lot of work with schools and school children in finding ways that we can still get them physical activity, even though it's hot out, by thinking about how we're designing spaces or giving them the educational tools to play safely in the heat. So there's a lot of thinking around vulnerable populations, how they can still be safely active in the heat, so that we call it livability, right? We want people to still be able to live, not just have to survive in hot places.
And I ask this question on behalf of many who I'm sure have had a similar thought, and I'm sure you're queried about this all the time. When we see people working outside here in the heat of summer,
Mhm.
many of them doing landscape or other work, they are fully dressed, long pants, sweatshirts, layers, hats, masks around them. Explain why they're doing that, and it's a very Andy-like and clothing-related question. So maybe Konrad, you can suggest to us why they're doing that and how impactful that is for them.
I think part of it is safety. I don't think many of them have a choice, right? So there's, you can think of a policeman, for example, too, right? To take it a little bit different. They have a set of clothing that's black that they have to wear, and they partially deal with it. A lot of them drink a lot of water. And the question is, can we, within, the scope of safety from, I don't know, mechanical point of view of not getting smacked by branches or scratched, use clothing that would make it more comfortable? There's a lot of interesting physics, and there's this kind of extreme example is there was an old paper in the 80s about Bedouin outfits, right? And there's Bedouins that are wearing pure white and black out in the Sahara. And well, it turned out that actually the temperatures and everything inside was about the same, because it essentially acted as a shield. The black one would heat up more, but then that created more airflow on the inside, and it's something called a thermal chimney. So it's just an example I like to use, that you're doing something that seems counterintuitive in the middle of the heat, right? In the middle of a desert, wearing something black, but as long as it was loose, it was still working well. There's probably they probably getting dehydrated more. But I think this is the interesting space of what can you do within the scope of staying safe and make people more comfortable.
And I want to touch on two things that you both have just mentioned. The first for Jenny, the Australian Open happens to be on right now. I don't watch all that much tennis. I used to play a lot, but you can see that they are battling the heat. It's like a third opponent, and you worry for some of them. You can see that the stress on their bodies is visible, and their ability to persist in these long matches, but yet what you just mentioned, their determination, right? They're playing in a major tournament. They're obviously a high performance athlete. You can see them battling the heat and what they know is happening to their body. And to both of you, you can only drink so much fluid and so much water, and even that can be dangerous. So Jenny, since you're interested in athletes and what I just mentioned, any thoughts about that?
So I have so many thoughts. And the first thing to think about here is that being acclimatized to the heat in that situation gives you an extreme competitive advantage. So for athletes coming into the Australian Open in tennis, they would hopefully have been acclimatizing, meaning exposing themselves to the heat and doing some intense physical activity under those hot conditions, so that their bodies are able to physiologically respond to that higher heat load. That's the number one thing you need to see athletes do before these events, whether it's a runner or a tennis player or a beach volleyball player. And then in those situations, what needs to be happening is people on the outside protecting the athletes and making decisions on, it's this hot, we need to give both athletes or all athletes on the court a longer break. And we've seen that become more acceptable in sports, even World Cup soccer, we've seen it, and then tennis. And with the Australian Open, our colleague, Ollie J, and his team at their Heat and Health Research Center at the University of Sydney actually run an environmental monitoring unit on every single court at the Australian Open. So they have the microclimatic conditions and they make decisions from those data, run it through an energy balance model, and are able to say how extreme those conditions are for the athletes and what they're wearing, what they're doing, and then make decisions on, do we close the dome? Do we not? How does that, can we make that equal across all the athletes in all these different stadiums, right? Because even competing in the heat on one day, you're going to have a harder time recovering for the next match the next day. So there's so many considerations and fairness across the sport.
And I'm going to bring up the surface of the court in a minute as it relates to surfaces in cities as well. But Konrad, you mentioned hydration. Speak to heat and people's tendency to drink or need to drink a lot of water, and the flow through there, I understand, on workers is also impactful on their health and internal organs.
Absolutely. So yes, you should drink a lot to be able to evaporate. But at the same time, if you've had the experience, I've definitely had the issues with depletion of electrolytes. Right, I went out, exercise, had a gallon plus of water over a couple hours, and then started feeling funny, right, with being perfectly hydrated. Even though you're drinking, you just might not be able to sweat it out fast enough to evaporate and do the cooling. So I think people have to be very careful, right, with that. And there's a lot of experts at ASU that specifically look at the hydration, what you hydrating with, and also what you did the day before. Per kind of the athlete discussion, I think it's really important to also bring in the motivation, and then there's the difference between what is happening to the body and what people think is happening to the body. And so it's thermal perception versus actual state. And this is when people get into trouble, because you can change the perception by, for example, something like cooling the neck, like little ties you might put in. And that doesn't do much to your core temperature. There's just not enough area, but it makes you feel cooler. So there's been studies on athletes that they'll cool the neck and they'll think they're better. So they'll push themselves more than they would without that. So I think in these extreme climates and extreme efforts, right? So either working or something like military or athletes, you have to be very mindful of what the person thinks versus what is actually happening to the body.
Based on what Konrad just said, people have a perception maybe that they're doing well, but they're not. And I think the city of Phoenix has intervened with regard to that by saying maybe we shouldn't have our hiking trails, which are going up steep mountains, open in the summer because people are having to be rescued. They thought they were okay. They thought they could do this, and it turns out they can't, maybe feeling they were more capable, or maybe they've come from another climate or another place and didn't realize how strenuous this was going to be and or how hot it was going to be. But the closing down of a public amenity versus personal safety based on the data that you have, how do you reconcile all of that?
Well, I agree with what the city of Phoenix does, and I think it's necessary. And there's so many reasons for it. You mentioned people from out of town. A lot of the rescues that happen on those two popular mountains that are closed during the hottest time of a heat warning day are for people who are not from here.
And there's now discussion of closing them for months at a time, which is, I think, where citizens here who live in this area are saying we're smarter than that.
Yeah. And so I think that needs to be a further discussion on how to do that well without closing a really valuable public space. People do tend to overestimate their abilities in the heat, and then heat sneaks up very quietly and you can become very ill, and it's very dangerous. And I'm at fault for that. I'll go on a run and it gets too hot in that half an hour and I need to slow down and go home, and I really need to rethink that, right? Or need to take a different route. And so even me as a researcher in this, I have to really think, is this okay to do? Am I prepared to do it? am I doing it in a safe way? Because I know it's still important to expose myself to the heat so I can acclimatize, which a lot of local people understand as well. But it's kind of thinking about in these situations where someone's going for a hike, potentially in the late morning, and it gets very, very hot very quickly around that time of day. And as they're descending the mountain, are they able to safely do that on some tough terrain as well? And so even this past summer, a local person did need rescue, I believe. And we saw a little boy die on a mountain that doesn't get closed in the city of Phoenix. And so it does come down to life or death in some of these situations. I don't know if the right thing is to be closing it the entire summer or having more restrictions, or, I mean, we also put our first responders at risk and the park rangers at risk who have to go do these rescues in these harsh conditions. And then it's a lot of public money that goes into doing these rescues or keeping people safe. So that's part of the entire discussion as well. So it'll be interesting to see what happens, but I understand both sides of it.
And obviously, the decision to take a hike on a mountain is a personal one, although for that child, not so much. But for many people who are unhoused in the city and other places, it is a matter of life and death in a much more difficult circumstance. So, how, in closing, do you see your interest in heat impacting the body and the negative effects, particularly, and helping to ameliorate those situations, and its relationship to the issue of housing, how cities are designed, the surfaces that we use, other things that people of lesser means don't have access to? How is heat a leading indicator of things that you think we need to do societally? And maybe I'll start with Konrad and conclude with Jenny.
Sure, right. So probably the best thing is to keep people indoor if you can for their safety.
We're trying to do, using
But
libraries and other places.
But that brings up another issue, right? Is the library meant to be taking showers in, or is it meant for my kids to get books? So you see, things get very complicated very quickly in that space. And I think for me, we're creating tools and information to help people make more informed decisions. But I am not on the decision-making side. I'll put it that way.
Yeah. So I think, well, there's what's neat to start off with is that a lot of researchers at ASU have really nice, close partnerships with people making those important decisions. We can help them with data. We can help them. They might have a question and we can say, well, let's see what Andy says, or let's see what this model says. So that's exciting, number one, in this space. But I like how you framed your question there around how is heat a leading indicator of thinking about other larger, grander issues in society, that heat is just exacerbating the problem. So if we think about our unhoused population here, that is a large problem of affordable public housing, mental health issues, so many other intersecting factors that come into play that then put heat on top of that, and rising temperatures that we haven't experienced to this extent and length before. And you're really amplifying the problem of lack of affordable public housing, lack of good paying jobs, mental health challenges, issues with drug and substance abuse. And heat just exacerbates all of that, right? And so if we are able to house people and get them in cooling, the same way in the north of the country right now, people need heating. You cannot survive right now in most of the north part of our country. It's horribly cold without heating. And I think we have to also rethink how we think about like living in a hot place, because we do need cooling to live in a hot place the same we need heating to live in a cold place. And for some reason, the rhetoric around it is, oh, you shouldn't live there. It's too hot to live there. But we don't say that about cold places. And so that it's not just getting people out of the heat. It's almost saying everybody deserves that, like life saving resource, but how do we do that? I think our point in time count last year was 9,500 people living on the streets at one time, or living unhoused.
Right. You've hit on a number of other podcasts, which is why people are gravitating to Phoenix, given some of the challenges that are so obvious, like increasing heat and, if you will, what appear to be less than durable water resources, whatever. But they are coming here. And so managing a place like this with the way that we build and the way we accommodate those who may not have the resources we have access to seems enormously important. And what Phoenix can share with how we're doing that with other cities, I think is going to be incredibly valuable. And a lot of it thanks to your work. So Jenny and Konrad, thank you so much for your insights today. And thank Andy for me. Thank all your other colleagues that you're, the family that you're building there. And I really appreciate your time today.